at usfca.edu, and we can get you a recording. We have over 250 people expected to join us today, so everyone has automatically been muted to minimize any interruptions. However, we would really love for you to engage with this conversation by submitting questions through the Q&A feature. Chesa will be answering those towards the end of the program, though we may not be able to get to every question. With that, I would like to introduce today's speakers. First of all, Professor Lara Bazelon is the director of USF School of Law's Criminal and Juvenile Justice and Racial Justice Clinical Programs. She is also a regular contributor to outlets including Slate, Politico, and the New York Times, and is the author of Rectify, The Power of Restorative Justice After Wrongful Conviction. Lara was recently appointed as the Philip and Muriel Barnett Professor of Trial Advocacy, which is an endowed chair position here at USF School of Law that recognizes a faculty member with significant experience in trial advocacy. San Francisco District Attorney Chesa Boudin became San Francisco's DA in January of this year. Chesa is now one of a growing number of DAs advocating reforms in the criminal justice system to reduce mass incarceration and address the racial and economic inequities in the system. Today, he is concerned about the health of prisoners in San Francisco's jails, their guards, and the families that they return home to. He is also concerned about those in homeless encampments and other communities who do not have access to proper social distancing and sanitation. Thank you so much, Lara and Chesa.
Thank you so much, Caroline, for that wonderful introduction. Chesa, it's really nice to see you, however, remotely, and thank you so much for doing this webinar. We're really excited to have you. So I wanted to start by asking you how your daily life has changed as San Francisco's district attorney, and in particular, how the functioning of your office has changed since the pandemic. I think you're muted.
I think he's unmuted now, Lara.
Oh, great. Okay. Sorry, Chesa, you were muted. So if you just wouldn't mind just beginning that answer from the get-go.
No, I knew I was muted. I was asking for help unmuting. I was unable to unmute myself.
Got it.
So
okay.
I appreciate that. I may have logged in with the wrong account despite all of your best planning efforts. So sorry for that. And thank you for hosting and for organizing. You know, one of the things that we realize is so critical to our way of life and to our social fabric as a democracy is these sorts of intellectual gatherings and discussions. And I just want to thank you, Lara, and all of the rest of the team at USF for organizing this for us, even though it is remote. To answer your question, Lara, you know, life has changed a lot for all of us, of course. And in the in the Hall of Justice in San Francisco, we are still conducting business, but it is very reduced. And we're basically only doing, as they say, essential business. So we are doing new arraignments of new criminal cases. We are doing pleas to resolve cases. And just this week, we started doing, again, for the first time in a couple months, preliminary hearings. Most of the staff that work for me have been making their court appearances remotely via Zoom. Some are going to court occasionally. I've gone myself to court a couple of days to help run calendars before our Zoom setup was working. And we have not conducted a jury trial in a couple of months now. So it's a really challenging time, as it is for everybody. We are trying to balance the procedural and constitutional rights of those who are accused of crimes, to give them process, to give them opportunities to move the charges against them forward, and also, of course, to balance the rights of the public and of crime victims who ordinarily would be able to come to court and watch what's happening in a case that they're interested in, with the broader public safety and public health issues that this crisis has made so apparent to all of us.
I know that this is such a tricky balancing act, and you've alluded to some of the challenges. Another big challenge, of course, is what's going on in the jails. And you have gotten some national attention for your plan in cooperation, I believe, with the head of the Public Defender's Office and also the Sheriff's Department to decarcerate the jails. Decarcerate is kind of a legalistic term. And I'm wondering if you can talk about what that plan involves and how you've been carrying it out with these partners.
So decarceration means that instead of putting people in jail, we work to get people to places that are more appropriate for their needs and for the challenges that they present to themselves and their community. It means not relying on jail as a primary response to all of the social challenges that we have, whether it be addiction or mental illness or homelessness. It means not criminalizing poverty. It means using jails as a last resort instead of a first resort. In San Francisco, for reasons I'm happy to talk more about, we realized very early on that we had to quickly decarcerate in the context of COVID. And we have now reduced our jail population in the last 4 months by more than 40%. And we did that really to save lives. We did it because of the fear we had about COVID spreading within the jail, impacting jail staff, impacting court staff, and all of the communities that those folks go home to at the end of the day. Again, I can talk more about that, but the way we did it in San Francisco was partnering with all of the other justice partners, the public defender, the jail medical team, the sheriff's department, the probation department. And we basically cut the jail population into lots of different slices and then had people take the lead on working to identify mechanisms to safely release people from each of those categories. So one category, for example, was people over the age of 65. Another category was people with underlying medical conditions. Another category was people who were only facing misdemeanor charges. Another category was people who were only in custody because of a en route to or warrant from another jurisdiction, and so on. And we basically just took the entire jail population and strategically broke it down in a way that allowed us to really put effort into getting people released from custody and doing so safely with a reentry plan, with support and supervision to minimize the risk of people getting rearrested.
So I wanted to just follow up a little bit on your answer, and you did indicate that there was a lot more behind it, to ask questions about that vetting process, because I have a sense that many folks who are listening are wondering whether inevitably, because of statistical realities, someone who's been released will go out and commit a serious crime. And as I'm sure you know, that's happened already, for example, in Florida. Are you concerned about that kind of a backlash? And are you prepared with vetting procedures to really just tamp down on the possibility of it happening?
So, it's a great question. And the answer is, of course, yes, I'm concerned. I'm concerned for lots of reasons, because one of the challenges, one of the things that makes being a district attorney so difficult is the often real fear that someone who we had in custody and released, whether it was pretrial or after a sentence was served or whatever else, will end up committing another crime, especially a serious or violent crime. It's a reality that we live with, and it often informs the decisions that we make as district attorneys. And for decades, it has informed criminal justice policy across this country at the legislative level, in the courts, in district attorneys' offices. And it's why we've seen a one-way ratchet where the policies get tougher and tougher and tougher, where the sentences get longer and longer and longer without any regard for actual data or empirically informed policies. But because when someone gets released from jail and does something wrong, that's in the headlines. When someone gets released from jail and does everything right, it's never in the headlines. We never read about it. It's not newsworthy. Nobody considers it. Nobody pays attention to it. And so even if 99% of the time the reentry plan succeeds, it's the 1% that gets reported and that drives people's perceptions of public safety. So that's one reality that, of course, we're concerned about because of the perceptions and the media coverage. The other challenge for us is we're inheriting a system, a criminal justice system, where no one ever, and this is related to the first point, no one ever tested mass incarceration against any kind of empirical metrics. Nobody said, is sending people to prison for life under 3 strikes effective at reducing crime? No one ever said, is it a cost-efficient way to respond to crime in terms of tax dollars? And no one ever said, does this actually provide healing or meaningful support and satisfaction to victims of crime? We simply did it blindly. Now we're trying to do something different. We're trying to rely less on incarceration and more on investment in the community, on getting at the root causes of crime, on giving victims a voice through restorative justice programs. And there's demands from all sides that we show our new approach works. And we want to, and we're working on data to do just that. I can tell you that, for example, of the people who we released early from the jail, one of the categories we looked at was people who had already been sentenced to jail and who were within a couple months of their release. And we worked out in most of those cases a way to release them early in advance of their scheduled release date. Now, it's something that we all, of course, as I said, live in fear about to a certain extent. And recidivism is a reality. 2/3 of people coming home from state prison, no matter how long their sentence served will be back in prison within a couple of years. And yet, with the group of people we released early from San Francisco County Jail, I think only 3 of them, or about 7%, were rearrested on new charges prior to when they would have been released. So our reentry planning, our hard work on the front end has thus far been successful. Of course, we are concerned about the victims of the crimes in those individual cases. But we know that big picture, these decisions across the board are actually reducing the harm and reducing the risk of death and of violence in our community.
So you've mentioned some really innovative things that you've done since taking office, and you talked about seeing things from the perspective of victims. And I think I heard you say that not all victims speak with one voice, and sometimes restorative justice, for example, should be on the table, other alternatives to mass incarceration. You campaigned on a very bold reform platform, and it had a ton of moving parts. And my understanding was that they were going to get rolled out in waves. And I am wondering to what extent some of these reforms have been put on hold or just held up because of the pandemic.
So we had, as you said, a bold agenda, and we knew that we wouldn't be able to implement all of the reforms we committed to immediately. It simply takes time to hire staff and to build up capacity and to develop protocols and also to shift the culture of what people involved in the justice system expect. And so there's a lot of work involved in many of the reforms that we committed to making. But I am proud to say we've made really significant progress, even just in my first 3.5 months. Specifically, I'll just go through at a high level some of the policies and programs we've already implemented, following through on campaign promises. And I'm happy to unpack any of them more if there are questions. We ended the practice of asking for money bail. My staff is no longer allowed to ever ask for money bail in any case. We implemented a primary caregiver diversion program so that parents can get parenting skills and supports to be home with their families instead of incarcerated. We implemented a presumption against charging any case stemming from a pretextual traffic stop as a way to reduce racial disparities and really get at this phenomenon that is now known across the country as driving while black or driving while brown. We implemented a presumption against charging status enhancements that publish people for who they are or what they've already been convicted of, instead of simply focusing on the charges at hand. We also hired a lawyer who's going to be starting our economic crimes against workers unit, and really excited about that work, particularly in the context of COVID-19, and all of the problems we're seeing with folks who are doing the most dangerous jobs and often being misclassified, mislabeled, or otherwise exploited by employers. We also have launched a restorative justice project, which has a long way to go, and we're hoping to grow it substantially. But it's a really exciting partnership with Impact Justice and Community Works West and other community-based organizations. Those are just a few of the highlights of the things that we promised to do that we've already been able to do. There's a lot more work ahead of us, and in some ways, COVID-19 is slowing us down. Of course, we have less staff, we have constant crises and emergencies that we're putting out, inventing new procedures for handling courtrooms via Zoom, on the fly. But at the same time, we're working really hard to find silver linings and to, for example, use this as an opportunity to digitize our case files, to work on electronic communication with the police department and other agencies we partner with, where traditionally it's been paper communication. So there are silver linings, and we're working hard to make those silver linings carry through into the post-COVID-19 world whenever we get there.
So one thing I think that may be a new pressure point is this sense that quote unquote non-vulnerable populations are feeling particularly vulnerable in this moment. And Caroline referred to your concern for vulnerable populations, and we've talked about that a lot. How do you reassure people who are so-called considered less vulnerable, who are frightened, who are making, for example, in other states, runs on gun stores, or people who are in grocery stores and pharmacies and afraid for their health or afraid of some kind of street crime? Do you have answers for them and their concerns and their feeling less safe?
Fear is a difficult thing for most of us to manage. And sometimes our fear is really rational, and it's really rooted in facts and objective realities, and sometimes it's not. And of course, I can't tell an individual person who has themselves been a victim of a crime not to be scared of that happening again. And most of us have at some point in our lives been victims of some kind of crime. But we need to look as policymakers and as department heads and as elected officials, and hopefully in the academy and in the press as well, we need to look to not the outlier or the anecdote, but to the empirical data. And if you look, for example, at the San Francisco Police Department crime dashboard, you will see that crime is substantially down this year, and it's substantially down by an even greater degree during the COVID-19 crisis. Doesn't mean that there's no crime happening, doesn't mean that everything is perfect, but it does mean this is actually a safer time by most metrics than previous periods have been. And 2019 was the year with the lowest violent crime in San Francisco history going back to the 1960s. So we are living in an exceptionally safe moment in American and San Francisco history. We do still have challenges around property crime primarily, around open air drug sales. And of course, every single violent crime, whether it's a robbery or a sexual assault or a murder, is something that we take very seriously, and even one is too many. So I want to be very clear, we are extremely concerned about any number of those crimes. Even one is too many. But we also need to have historical perspective and objective analysis of what's happening. And what's happening is crime is at its lowest rates, pretty much on record. And that's a good thing. I'm not taking credit for it. I think in many ways it's a byproduct of the shelter-in-place order. But I also think, our ability to reduce the jail population by 40% without having crime rates spike is indicative of the ways in which incarceration fails to keep us safe. Now, I knew that when I ran for district attorney last year before COVID-19. I ran on a platform committed to ending mass incarceration because I believed that putting people in jail as a first and primary response to virtually every single category of crime is not only expensive and dehumanizing, but it also increases public safety risks increases harm, and makes a cycle of crime and violence inevitable. COVID-19 has showed us all the more why mass incarceration is a threat to us all. And I'm happy to talk more about the ways in which jails and prisons in particular present a unique public safety risk in the context of COVID-19.
So I think I only have time to ask you one more question because people were submitting questions even before you and I started talking, and I want to make sure that we get to as many of those as possible. But I want to end by asking you a slightly more personal question. I think many of the people listening are law students, are young lawyers, are activists, and you've set such an amazing example of an insurgent campaign that was run on bold reform. And I think to do that, you had to have a lot of inspiration and also confidence. And I'm wondering if there is some kind of a formative experience that you had either in law school or maybe in practice before you started running that inspired you to do this and that you think might resonate with people who are looking for ways to be inspired to take bold steps themselves.
I could tell so many stories, but let me start by thanking you for your generous question. It was very kind. We didn't know what to expect when we launched the campaign. I'd never run for office. It was, a big shift for me to go from handling my own kind of individual caseload as a public defender to being totally in the public eye. And I was really excited that my message and my vision connected with and resonated with San Francisco voters. It's such a humbling opportunity to serve this city and to help this city play a leadership role in the country as the entire country experiences waves of criminal justice reform and looks for empirically based best practices that can allow us to reduce the cost, human and economic, of incarceration while also improving public safety. So to get to your question though, I don't have necessarily any one moment. I have so many things throughout my life that have inspired me and given me hope and given me focus. But I'm thinking right now of a client who I represented in my first year as a public defender. And he was charged with shoplifting. And the evidence seemed really strong. There was video footage of him in the store putting things in a bag that he brought with him. There was also video footage of him being arrested by loss prevention officers after he'd left the store without paying. There was a signed confession. And because it was his first offense, the court was offering to give him pretrial diversion, which he's entitled to by law in San Francisco. And I was encouraging my client to do that because it was a path to earning a clean record. And he had his whole life ahead of him. He was a young African-American male, did not need any criminal record. And so I was encouraging him to do the safe thing. And particularly because I evaluated the evidence and it looked strong. Looked like we didn't have a chance at trial. And he said to me, I don't want to do pretrial diversion. I'm innocent. I want a trial. And we had a lot of difficult conversations about it. And I was a little unsure what I was going to say to the jury. But when my client got on the witness stand, he had the courage and he had the confidence to tell his own truth and his own story, which was that he was walking out of the store not to steal, but to find cell phone coverage so that he could make a phone call to his mother who was picking him up. And his mother testified. And the jury heard them both and believed them both. And we ended up winning that trial. And it was such a high risk decision for him to make with his whole life ahead of him. But it was the right decision for him because he didn't do anything wrong in his mind. He was innocent. He was wrongly accused. And because he was entitled to his day in court. And so I think sometimes we have to be willing to do things that are higher risk, that are bolder and more forward looking. And we have to do things that are true to ourselves and our values, even when it goes against the grain. And I try to remember that courage when I make difficult decisions as well.
Thank you for that answer. I love that answer. I am going to now turn to questions because there is a queue. And before I start, I want to apologize in advance for my perhaps mispronouncing the names of some of the folks who are submitting questions, and also for my wiggling around so much. I've been trying to get to a point in my house where my face isn't blacked out. There are many challenges associated with the COVID virus, and one of mine has been not having an office anymore. So I will start with William's question to you, and it's this. He wrote, do you see any conflicts between protecting vulnerable populations and protecting non-vulnerable populations at the same time? So in other words, do you see any cases where protecting vulnerable populations comes at the expense of disregarding the well-being of non-vulnerable populations?
Thank you for the question, William. I'm sure we could come up with some scenarios where, if we frame the hypothesis the right way, where there is that trade-off. But as district attorney, I was elected to help protect all of the public, no matter how vulnerable, no matter how insulated. And when we talk about vulnerability, it's really important to remember that there are lots of different kinds of vulnerability, right? COVID-19 has made us aware of the ways in which age or certain underlying medical conditions can make people particularly vulnerable. People who are unhoused, who don't have a safe place to sleep at night, are also really vulnerable. People who have expensive cars and go shopping in luxury stores are vulnerable in a different way. They're vulnerable to being targeted because of their wealth or their resources. People with different races or genders or religions are vulnerable to certain kinds of crime, like hate crime. So we all, in different ways, have vulnerabilities. And what I try to do in my policymaking is think holistically about big picture, how we can maximize the benefit and minimize the harm that people are exposed to. Something like COVID-19 puts that in stark contrast, right? We're not just worried about sexual assault in jail, which we know is a real phenomenon, which we know a significant percentage of people who spend time behind bars will experience. That's a particular kind of vulnerability that is often ignored when we talk about the cost benefit of using jail as a primary response. But with COVID-19, we're looking at people who are in jail, and we've got about 800 people a day who go into the San Francisco County Jail to work. So even if you're not concerned about the folks who are in jail and vulnerable to COVID-19 because of their incarceration and they're sleeping in bunk beds and they're not allowed to have hand sanitizer under normal circumstances, limited access to hygiene, people cycling in and out, churning, as the technical term is to describe people coming in and out of jail every day as police make arrests and other people get released. Tremendously vulnerable to COVID-19, but it's not just the people in the jail that are vulnerable. It's the sheriff's deputies, the guards, the medical staff, the social workers, the contractors, the 800 or so people a day that come in and out of the San Francisco County Jail for work and go home to their families. So I think when we're big picture, we're actually seeing ways in which folks who you might pit against each other with a narrow framing have really common interests, and that when one person's vulnerable in our community, we're all vulnerable.
This question is from Rebecca, and she wrote, how are you working to ensure that defendants are not being unduly coerced into guilty pleas with a threat of possible illness and death if they are sentenced to prison or must stay in pretrial detention?
Thanks for the question, Rebecca. It's a challenge that we have in the criminal justice system, even absent COVID-19, but I think COVID-19 puts a much sharper point on it, as your question makes clear. One of the problems with money bail, one of the reasons why I dedicated much of the last 5 years of my career to fighting against money bail, one of the reasons why ending money bail was one of the first things I did as San Francisco's district attorney, was because it's immoral and unethical to ask someone to waive their rights and plead guilty to get out of jail simply because they're too poor to buy their way out, when a wealthy person wouldn't have to make that same choice. So we moved from a wealth-based detention system to a risk-based detention system. It eliminates the coercive effect of money bail on the poor, but it doesn't eliminate the potential that someone who is in pretrial detention would still plead guilty to get out of jail. Now, we are committed to reducing the jail population, particularly in the context of COVID-19. And we've done so in ways that are unparalleled throughout the country. But there are still some cases where we offer someone a credit for time served plea deal, but not many. And the reason that we don't do it often is because if we believe someone is safe to be released, then we release them pre-trial in most cases because they are presumed innocent. And because we believe that the California and the US Constitution require the presumption of innocence and liberty as a fundamental right, mean that if someone can safely be released before they've been convicted of a crime, then they should be. That's what the Constitution says. In cases where someone cannot safely be released, that doesn't often change simply because they waive their rights and plead guilty. So we are not trying to coerce people, we're trying to do the opposite, and we are trying to find safe ways to get as many people out of jail as quickly as possible as we can. But the system is set up in ways that means there may always be some inherent risk of coercion. We do our best to minimize it, to avoid it. And the efforts we make to get people out of jail, maybe with less serious charges or with less serious criminal histories or with better reentry plans, means that those folks who are left in the jail are much safer than they were 2 months ago when the population was 40% higher.
This question is from John Michael, and he writes, I was going home from the Tenderloin and I was so upset that I saw the unhoused community were all gathered around a public library, worried about the community spreading of COVID-19 from infecting each other in the community. So I decided to call 311. I was so upset that all the operator could say is that there's nothing they could do because they are quote unquote homeless. I thought we had empty hotel rooms that are going to be used to house our homeless community. It would be cheaper to pay for their rooms, even for a couple of months, than to pay for their hospital bills and the chance of everyone else getting infected.
I share the frustration, and I think it's an area where San Francisco and the whole country, frankly, have a lot of room for improvement, not just in the context of COVID-19, but for far too long, jails have been used as a dumping ground for the mentally ill and for people who could more humanely, more effectively, and more cheaply be provided with the services they need in mental health housing. We have people on any given day in the San Francisco County Jail who have been conserved, who are not legally capable of making decisions about their own well-being, and who are simply in jail because we don't have beds available for them in appropriate mental health care facilities, even though those mental health care facilities are less expensive and are actually designed to provide these folks with the treatment and services that they need. It's frustrating would be an understatement. It's a waste of money, it's inhumane, it interferes with the core work of keeping the public safe that we should be engaged in. And it also means, because we're not funding upstream interventions, housing, healthcare, drug treatment, it means we are actually making our city much less safe for all of us because we don't intervene and we don't provide services until people commit a serious crime. It's really, really poor policy. It's poor financial management, and it's inhumane. So I share the frustration, and I am committed to continuing to be a voice for having upstream interventions that get people off the street and on their feet.
This is a question from Jesse. I'm gonna, I think, paraphrase it a little bit because it gets to something so important. Jury trials are a critical way for the system to function. And Jesse asks about, in some kind of a post-COVID era, is there an update on how jurors are going to be protected once we resume jury trials? So do you see jurors being seated 6 feet apart instead of right next to each other in the jury box? And will individuals who are vulnerable to COVID-19 be excused? Do you think that jurors will be provided with masks? And I guess my add-on to Jesse's question too is, if you are going to excuse certain vulnerable populations, is that going to skew the jury in a way that could be problematic?
Absolutely. It will skew the jury in a way that's problematic, although I'll point out that our current approach already skews the jury in ways that are problematic. So some jurisdictions use voter registration, for example, as a basis for deciding who to call in for jury. Others use driver's license or DMV. There are most jurisdictions don't allow people who have been convicted of a felony to serve on juries. There are lots of decisions, some technical, some legal, about who serves on juries that tend to skew the composition of our jury pool in San Francisco and across the country. This would be a new and heavy skew because we wouldn't be able to have people with medical vulnerabilities on the jury, or maybe even people who are over the age of 65. So it would certainly change the composition of juries substantially. Our Hall of Justice in San Francisco is seismically unsafe. It's decrepit. It has infestations. We've been trying to vacate it so we can rebuild it for years. The notion that we're going to somehow redesign our courtrooms in the short term to allow for social distancing on a jury is just not realistic. But I agree, jury trials are essential. They're a critical check on the evidence that my office presents, and they're a critical and fundamental constitutional right of people accused of crimes in this country. We need to find a way to allow jury trials to proceed sooner than later. But as a trial lawyer, I hate the idea of trying a case in front of a jury wearing masks. I want to see their face. I want to see how they respond to the answer a witness gives or to the question that I ask. I want to be able to engage with them and make eye contact meaningfully when I'm giving my closing argument. And that's not possible if people are wearing masks or if they're appearing for jury duty via Zoom. So it's a great question. It's one I've been pondering a lot. We've been working with our Superior Court to develop a protocol that would allow us to begin conducting jury trials sooner than later. But it's an imperfect procedure, and it is one that would leave us without the benefit of members of the community who are older or medically vulnerable.
This is a question from Steve. He wrote that he's been hearing about stories of many open stealing from grocery markets and pharmacies. So it's happening, he says, because there's either lax or no enforcement. And he wants to know, is this a matter that you're aware of? Does it have your attention as a growing criminal activity and, in a way, also a quality of life issue?
San Francisco last year, I think, had the highest property crime rates of any other major city in the country. But in this year, from January 1st to date, theft crimes are down 17%. And, that's a significant drop, a lot of it attributable to COVID-19. If you go to, from March 16th to the present, sort of the heartland of the COVID-19 era, larceny crimes are down 58% and crime across the board is down 42%. So I think it's a real issue. Of course, in San Francisco, we still have far too much of this kind of behavior and we're working hard to reduce it. But the numbers are actually moving drastically in the right direction, far faster than I could have hoped for when I took office, or than we could have expected absent COVID-19. I think also it's important to remember we live in a region and in a city where there are tremendous historic extremes in access to resources and wealth and poverty. We have some of the wealthiest people in the history of the world living in our city. And in our city as well, we have people who have absolutely nothing. And when you have that kind of disparity in close proximity, property crime is always going to exist to some degree. And we're going to continue to fight it, and we're going to continue to find ways to give people who have nothing the services and support they need so they don't resort to property crime. And we're going to continue to find innovative ways to work with the San Francisco Police Department to reduce property crime and deter it. And we're going to continue to innovate collaborative courts so that when people get arrested for these kinds of crimes, we're pairing them with services and incentivizing them to change their lifestyle and take advantage of opportunities and resources that exist. But it's unrealistic to think that property crime is going to disappear in a city like San Francisco.
This is kind of a related question by Sophia, who lives in the Tenderloin and says that she's been subject to and also witnessed some crimes that concern her, including violent crimes. And she's wondering what your opinion is on this idea that many crimes are not being reported because they involve actions committed by and upon, for example, people who are transient or people who are undocumented. And I actually have an add-on to that too, which is I've been wondering a lot about domestic violence and intimate partner violence crimes. Those reports are also going down sharply, but it's not clear to me whether that's because there are actually less of them or whether because the COVID-19 crisis has made reporting them so much more challenging for victims.
Great questions. Domestic violence is an area that we've been really focused on in this period for exactly the reason that you mentioned, Lara. You know, we saw in the first week of the shelter-in-place order a spike in requests for victim services support from our domestic violence team in the office, but since then a drop-off. We have seen a decline in the number of domestic violence cases presented to our office as well. And we don't believe it's because there's less domestic violence happening. We believe because, as your question suggests, that people are not reporting it. So I want to take a step back and go to the original question, and then I'll talk about some of the things we're doing. We absolutely believe, and we know for certain, that many crimes, including violent crimes, often go unreported. One of the reasons why I'm so committed to implementing reforms that can help rebuild trust between high crime communities and law enforcement is so that we can have a better sense of what crimes are actually being committed and a better chance of actually solving them. When people don't trust law enforcement, when they don't agree with or support the outcomes that follow when they report a crime to the police, they're less likely to report and less likely to cooperate if a crime gets reported by somebody else. In order to do my job effectively, in order to empower the police to do their job effectively, we need to restore trust between communities and law enforcement. We have a lot of work to do. We have a long way to go, but I hope some of the policy changes I've made, like the pretextual traffic stop policy, will move us in the right direction. With regard to the efforts that we're taking, specifically with regard to domestic violence, because of our concerns in this space, we've partnered with Veritas, the mayor of San Francisco, and other San Francisco city agencies to find 20 fully furnished apartments that are available to domestic violence victims and their families who need a safe place to live during this crisis. We've also partnered with Lyft to provide free transportation to people who need to get away from an abuser and find shelter or safety, but don't have access to a car or the means to pay for transportation. We've also been working around the clock with our law enforcement partners and our community-based organization partners to have a public awareness campaign around things like hate crimes and domestic violence and victim empowerment. So we're doing everything we can to get the word out to people, to be available to folks in a time of need, to encourage people to promote, to come forward and report, and also to provide services to people who need them, regardless of whether they report a crime, regardless of whether police make an arrest, and regardless of whether we file charges. Our victim services team is there to help.
This is a question from Joe, and you had mentioned partnering with the mayor, and I'm curious to know what insight you have into the protections that are being provided to the police, who are, of course, first responders in their own way. Are they getting the necessary protective equipment that they need to do their jobs?
I'm sure that police could use more equipment, but we have thus far been able to navigate the first couple months of this crisis without a significant number of positive tests among the police department, among the sheriff's department, or among our other first responders, like the fire department. Of course, we've had some, and we've had a large number of people exposed, but luckily we've avoided the kind of worst case scenarios we've seen in some other jurisdictions across the state and across the country, where entire departments or police departments have been shut down by COVID-19. I think it's a testament both to the leadership of Chief Scott and other city leaders, and also to the way in which, as a community, we've risen to this challenge and managed to keep the death toll low, the infection rate low in San Francisco, and also the ways in which we responded earlier than other jurisdictions and started having best practices put in place from an earlier stage. So I think it's a real risk. It continues to be a risk. I have multiple phone calls a week with Chief Scott and other justice partners, where we check in about each other's staffing and about ways we can help support each other in keeping our staff healthy.
This question is from Lauren. He wants to know, and I do too, whether you're concerned about a backlog of cases due to how reduced the court's operations have become, and once this health crisis slows down, how you're going to catch up on all of the backlog.
I am concerned. It's something I spent a lot of time anxiously worrying about and trying to find solutions for. So a couple things that play into it. One is the rate of new case filings has gone substantially down. We get about a third as many cases presented to us in most categories right now as was typical before COVID-19. And part of that is, as I said, crime is falling. So we have less crimes to prosecute. That helps. It means that caseloads have stayed pretty steady during the last 2 months. They've gone up a little bit, but they haven't skyrocketed. We are still working hard to settle cases. We've just started doing preliminary hearings in the court again yesterday. That's going to further help us settle cases and move cases forward. And we've tried to do the kind of essential court work that's necessary to identify cases that shouldn't have been filed and dismiss them, to make plea offers and resolve cases that can be resolved. I certainly expect that we'll have a backlog of trials and of evidentiary hearings and of lots of the really important but non-essential work that the court does. For example, return of property motions and work that I know your clinic has been involved in, Lara, for example. Work around clean slate or expungement of people's records. A lot of work that, particularly for immigration issues, can be critically important, but is not essential in this moment. There will be a backlog of that, and I think it's going to force us to all be more creative and more reliant on technology to be more efficient going forward, and that may be a silver lining as well.
This question is from Rawa, and it has to do with testing. And I think it's really important because the information around testing, both nationally and locally, is so confusing. And it seems like every day there's a different headline suggesting something else. She wants to know what's being done to protect both the people who are incarcerated and also the staff and the vendors, folks going in and out of these jails. Are you able to use mass testing? And if not, what kinds of testing is being implemented? And if there's a shortage of testing kits, how are you dealing with that?
Great question. The answer has sort of shifted over time. So both with regard to the jail and with regard to most public safety first responders and police, firefighters, paramedics, sheriff's deputies, the folks in my office who are going to court. In the beginning, in March and early April, the procedure was basically the city would only test people if they were symptomatic. And I'm not talking about one symptom. I'm not talking about just a cough. You had to have serious symptoms to get tested. Now there are far more tests available, and we're able to do testing far more broadly. It's still not enough, as I understand it. And mind you, I am not a scientist. I loved biology in high school, and I left it there. So, take what I say about the medical science, with a grain of salt. But we are now able to test every single individual coming into the county jail. And it's been really important because we've identified on the way in 2 individuals who were positive, but asymptomatic, people we would not otherwise have identified. Once those test results came back, we were able to immediately track down every single person they had come in contact with, the police that arrested them, the sheriff's deputies that processed them in, the jail medical staff that did their evaluation, and then test those individuals. So it's allowed us to do a much better job of keeping the virus under control, informing people who might not otherwise know that they're carriers. And we weren't doing that for the first month or so. We also now, as a city, have the ability to test any first responders or emergency essential workers who have reason to believe they've been exposed. So if my staff go to court and interact in some way with a sheriff's deputy who later tests positive, my staff have the ability to go get tested. So it is much expanded and much improved compared to where we were even just a couple of weeks ago.
This question is from Wayne, and he wants to know more about your new Economic Crimes Against Workers unit, what kinds of resources it will have, and what its focus will be.
So it's starting off with just one lawyer who will be in our broader special prosecution and white collar division of the office. It's a lawyer who brings, in some ways, a lifetime of experience dealing with labor issues. Both of his parents were labor organizers and labor lawyers, and he's built a career in San Francisco as a labor lawyer. As with most new things, we have to start small and build it. So we're starting with one lawyer full-time who will have the support of paralegals and investigators as needed. And he will hopefully be able to prove to me and to the city that there's a need to staff the unit more broadly and to hire other lawyers. That's what I'm cautiously optimistic about. It may take some time, but the kinds of cases that he's looking at are, for example, misclassification of workers as independent contractors, or unsafe work conditions, or systematic wage theft. Those kinds of cases, which we know affect public safety, which we know undermine public trust, which we know make people who are vulnerable even more vulnerable, are rarely investigated or prosecuted. And I'm really excited that we're going to start not only taking those cases on, but doing it in a way that really gives voice to some of our communities most often excluded and downtrodden, and folks who are having the most difficult time navigating the COVID-19 crisis.
This question is from an anonymous attendee who asks, does San Francisco remain a sanctuary city, or have revisions to this policy been made?
San Francisco remains a sanctuary city. That phrase, sanctuary city, is pretty broad, and we could spend a lot of time talking about what it means to be a sanctuary city. We identified as a sanctuary city long before the 2012, if I remember correctly, 2013, due process for all resolution was passed by the Board of Supervisors, July of 2013, which prohibited the sheriff from holding people in jail for ICE pickup or cooperating between law enforcement and ICE across the board. So we were a sanctuary city in 2012, even though at that time, 2011, 2010, even though at that time, the San Francisco sheriff would regularly hold individual people in the jail solely for the purpose of giving ICE time to come and pick them up. Since the July 2013 sanctuary city due process for all resolution passed, law enforcement at the local level is not allowed to cooperate in that way with ICE, absent a judicial warrant or court order. And that policy is still in place and still controls law enforcement's ability to cooperate with ICE. So we do not cooperate with ICE.
This is a question from Ms. Schaefer. She asks, what will be the indicators you look to know it is time to return to a more typical prosecutorial set of policies? Until there's a vaccine, until community spread of the virus is below a certain level, until the stay-at-home order is lifted, or do you see this as a permanent shift?
I hope that some of the shifts are permanent. For example, I hope that we can keep our jail population low. For example, I hope that we can continue to have the same laser focus on providing support and services to victims, especially victims of domestic violence. I hope that we can continue to process our rebooking decisions electronically rather than reverting to paper copies and face-to-face conversations. But with regard to the business we conduct in court, I think it's just going to be a gradual process, like so much else in this reopening. And it may be 2 steps forward, 1 step back. We started doing preliminary hearings yesterday for the first time in nearly 2 months, a month and a half. I'm hopeful that we'll be able to innovate technology that helps reduce the public health risk, that will manage the logistics of this transition smoothly. And the more we do, the more we'll feel comfortable doing. So I don't think it's going to be an all or nothing, flip the switch and go back to normal. I think it's going to be a gradual experimentation with new technology and new procedures. And we're going to go as fast as we feel comfortable when I say comfortable, I mean both in terms of public health with regard to COVID-19. It is really, really important to me to keep my staff safe. We cannot do our essential government functions if COVID-19 is affecting large numbers of my staff. Luckily, so far it has not. And we've been able to figure out ways to staff the courtrooms via Zoom and via in-person in a way that gives our staff with kids or with underlying medical conditions the ability to stay home. It's really important that we continue to do that. It's also important to me that we have a functioning justice system that gives victims their day in court, that respects the procedural and constitutional rights of people accused of crimes, and that moves cases quickly so that the wheels of justice are turning. So we're going to go as fast as we can do both of those things.
Thank you so much to both of you. We have time for just one more question. I was just doing a time check.
Sure. So this is another question from Joe, and I'm going to read it word for word to you. His question is, what is Chesa doing for crimes against the police? Question mark, question mark.
Well, it depends on the case. Crimes against police are really important. They're really serious. You know, people who are willing to attack or, you know, assault or otherwise victimize police officers in the line of duty, you know, in many ways represent one of the greatest threats to social order and to the smooth functioning of government. And so they're crimes that we take very, very seriously. We have a large number of cases pending right now that involve some category of crime against police, whether it's resisting arrest or reckless evading or assault on an officer. The flip side, of course, is that police have tremendous power and discretion. You know, they're allowed to carry guns, they're allowed to arrest people based on their say-so, and we need to be able to rely on and trust what police say. So in some cases where we're presented a case by police where they were assaulted, they want us to file assault on an officer charges, for example. If we don't have body-worn camera footage and police officer protocol and policy and the department says you're supposed to have your body-worn camera activated, that may be an impediment to us prosecuting the case. We need police, because they have so much power and so much discretion, to follow the rules and to follow the law. And in some instances where it's not clear that that happened, it makes it very difficult for us to file charges in those cases. But we absolutely take those cases very seriously. We look at them closely. We have follow-up conversations with the police officers. We file charges regularly when we're presented with a chargeable case that has a police officer as a victim.
Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Caroline, but I thank you for giving us your time. This was wonderful.
Thank you for organizing, and thanks for helping to bring such a dynamic group of voices together, albeit via Zoom. It's a great feature of USF Law School and of your work there, Professor Bazelon. So I'll look forward to doing this in person soon.
Me too.
Thank you so much to both of you for giving your time and for this great conversation. Thank you to everyone who joined today. Thank you for your questions, for your participation, and most of all, just for your care for the city of San Francisco during this time. I just wanted to mention again, we do have a recording of this available. So if you are interested in receiving that, please email lawevents@usfca.edu, and we would be happy to email that to you. So be safe, be well, everyone, and thank you again to Lara and to Chesa.
Thank you.